All right, so some general housekeeping. I made some changes, and it should be in a good way for all of us because this was kind of based on what I saw on Tuesday. So this week you'll watch Flask Part 1, which would have been from Tuesday. You'll have Flask Part 2, which will be from today. You will complete the Flask tutorial app, but you don't end up submitting. Okay, so we'll kind of go through as much of it we can here today, and then you guys will be responsible for finishing that out, but you won't submit that as your mini project. What I did was I went ahead and tweaked the schedule one more time. So if you go and check the syllabus, and I'm going to send an announcement out after this class so everybody's aware. What I did was I went ahead and turned Flask into a 2-week chunk, which basically just shifted the midterm exam at the end of the Django section. But based on some feedback and some emails and stuff I was seeing, it would probably be best if we go ahead and spend next week on Flask as well, primarily with working with the Jenga templates and some other stuff, because that's all applicable to Django. So if we understand that here next week, then we can apply that into the Django side, and that'll make Django go a little bit smoother as well, which means no homework this week. No mini project, no quiz, none of that this week. We'll do that next week. All right. So we'll complete the tutorial this week. Then next week we'll step into our mini project, kind of work through that together, particularly with the templates and getting all that working. And then you'll have a small quiz that'll be associated with Flask. Anybody have any questions about the change? Anybody have any problems with the change? Okay. All right. If anybody does have any problems with me making those changes, don't be afraid to tell me. As I kind of mentioned in the beginning, it's definitely going to be a tentative schedule till I get feedback from students as to if I'm moving too quickly, right? I can put this on a piece of paper, but until I get students in front of it and say, hey, it'd be nice if we slowed down and really understood this, then I need to slow down and do it. So, okay. And again, I'll send an announcement out on those changes in there. So in week 7, we were working on the Flask tutorial. And if you'll remember, this tutorial is to set up a basic blog application called Flasker. You'll be able to register, log in, create posts, edit, and delete their own posts. So far, we're up to what's called blueprints and views. And so this is really where you kind of set up how they're going to be able to view pages and be able to send information back to the user. Right now, if you remember, we're just kind of sending strings back to the user, and that gets set up as either headers or paragraph, as H1 tags or as paragraph tags back to the web server side. So today we're going to work a little bit with the views and how that comes in. So a view itself is a function of code that you write to respond to requests to the application. So if you remember HTTP, you have a request when we pull the page. This is going to dictate how that's going to function. So Flask is going to use patterns to match that incoming URL to a view that it should handle. And that view returns data to Flask that then turns that into an outgoing response. So Flask is also going the other directions. It can generate a URL to a view based on the name and argument. So what we're going to work with is blueprints. And blueprints are a way to organize a group of related views and other kind of code together. So it's a way of organization and putting everything the way it should be. All right. This little application is going to have 2 blueprints, one for authentication functions and one for all the blog post functions. So if you remember, this is a blog application, right? We have to be able to log in. So we have a whole mechanism of handling logins, passwords, all that kind of stuff. And then we have a whole nother mechanism for actually writing the blog posts, deleting blog posts, all that kind of stuff. All right, we're going to put each one of those into a separate module. So if you remember, modules are basically full-on Python files that we will then import into our core project. Okay. So we'll need to write our first module in here, and this is going to be our authentication module. So if we go into our setup here, I'll kind of shift some of this stuff back around. I'm not sure why it's all large, but it is. There we go. Okay. So if we go back and look at our Flask folder up here, we'll notice we still have init.py, we have our DB, and we have our schema. So where we left off was being able to automatically initialize the database, wipe the database if there was one, and get everything cleaned up with the initial setup and configuration of the project itself. And go side by side here. No. We were doing some testing. All right. That's why I had this pulled over. There we go. So we need to create an auth file in here. So if we go down, create a Python file. We'll go ahead and get that in. It's called auth. And we'll go ahead and copy and paste this part in. And so if we look at this, there's a couple of different pieces that we have here. We have func tools. And then from Flask, we're going to import this concept of blueprints, being able to set up Flash, redirects, render templates. We'll explain this in a little bit more detail. This WordSog security, if you remember, this is how we set up our session cookies inside Flask. And so we'll be able to import checking password hashes, generating password hashes, etc. So to set up the initial blueprint, we're going to set it up as auth, and the __ name is going to set it up so that it's passed as a second variable. This just tells us what our application name is. And then the URL prefix. This is the URL that we would go to. So instead of returning a simple page, we're actually going to set up a bunch of different type of returns on and off. All right. We do need to register this little blueprint inside of our application. So to register this to be used, we have to go back to our init file. And under our create app up here at the top, where we do at the bottom, underneath our import DB, we will add in from period import auth, which is going to import that auth file. And that we're going to go ahead and register our blueprint to our file. Go ahead and save that. Okay. So you can build out all these different views. In this case, we're just dealing with specifically the blueprint of auth, but you have to register that back in your initial file. Django is going to have something very similar to this concept. So you could build it all out and then go, why can't I get to auth? It's because you probably forgot to register it in the program. All right. From there, we're going to build out our first view. So we have this concept of a folder essentially called auth. We need to build the registration view, or how they're going to register for this application. So when a user is going to visit auth register, the URL, and it's going to return an HTML form for them to fill out. When they submit the form, we're going to validate that input and either show the form again with error messages or create a new user and go on to the login page. All right. So for now, what we're going to do is just view this code. So let's copy this in. I'll take a little bit more look at that in the auth folder, and that's going to go in after this initial blueprint section that you saw. All right. So this here is going to set up the route. In other words, just like what we did, if we go back to our main project and hello, remember we set up app route. That's a decorator that tells us exactly what page we're creating. So in this case, we're creating things for /register. And we have two methods that we expect to use here, both get and post. If you remember, when we initially set up and call for /register, that's a get. When we post our information from a form, that's an HTML post request. All right. So the first thing it's going to do is set up this function. It's going to check to see if it's a post first. In other words, are they submitting the form? If they are not submitting the form and we're just now rendering that to them, then we're going to go ahead and just come clear down here to render template auth register HTML. Right. We obviously don't have that file yet. We're going to create that. All right. We're also going to have a login page, so we can build that view right within this auth.py file. So we'll copy that in. And very similarly to the register page, we're going to use the methods of get and post for once they log in. If they are submitting their username and password to us, it will show up. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and just render the HTML page to them. All right. The couple things that we want to see here is if we look at this register, when we actually pull the information from them, for username, password, etc., we're going to get the database and we're going to check to see if that username is submitted. If not, we're going to send them back an error. If they have a password, if not, we're going to send them back an error. If there are no errors, we're going to attempt to insert that username and password into our database. Okay. When you deal with db.execute, this is basically sending a SQL statement, which we can see here, insert into, and then in this case, we're going to the user table and we're going to insert in username and password with the values of question mark, question mark. This is very similar, if you remember in Python, that we do with like F strings, right? Where we do variable substitution. In the old days, you might have used something like %s, same concept, but this is the SQL syntax for that. Once you get that up and running, you'll do a DB commit to commit that to the database. If something fails, for example, that username is already in the database and we get an error back. If you remember, we set up a primary key for an ID and that the username had to be unique. All right, we get that error back. Otherwise, we're going to redirect them right back to the auth.login after they register. Notice that we're using redirect, and then it's going to generate the URL for our auth.login, which is this down here. All right. In the login, we're going to do the same thing, only now we're doing a lookup as opposed to a commit to the database. We're looking up to see if the username they typed in matches what they said, and we're going to do a fetch one. All right. Fetch one just returns one query. In other words, don't show us all, just give us one line out of the database. If it matches their username and if it matches the password hash, then we go ahead and log them all the way in. All right. We're going to set up this session here. This session is again related back to the cookie session that we created earlier. Anybody have any questions on those moving parts? It'll make sense once we. What's that?
I see we're using like line 30. We're using a function generate password hash.
Yes.
Is that like an MD5 hash? Do you know?
We'll find out here, but I'm guessing this is being imported from this security package, and we can find out. It's a great question. My guess is it's pretty basic if I had to guess here. So there we go. We check the documentation. It should tell us what kind of hash. So it takes a plain text password, uses a hashing algorithm and a salt link. So by default, it's going to use SHA-256. Yeah,
that's good.
And a good salt string of at least 8 there to go along with it.
Yeah. All right.
Good question. Great question. Now, obviously, we can change that here. You know, I mean, we can pass a variable. So when we do this generate password hash here, you'll notice that we're just passing in the plain text password. We're not necessarily specifying what hash type, but I believe by default, it appears to be 256. Yeah, we definitely wouldn't want to use MD5. That would be bad. Okay. Same way when we use this check password hash, we basically pass in what the user did. We would check the hash coming out of the database and see if it matches the password here. So this check password hash takes in 2 variables, 1, the hash out of the database, 2, the password the user typed in. All right. Let's see. So session itself gets stored as a dictionary in Python. That's where we store like the user ID. We're going to store a, usually it's a UUID that's associated with that as well. They may not do that just yet in this basic application, but usually there's a UUID that's associated there. All right. From there, what we're going to do is create another function within our auth.py. This section is going to handle when we have a logged in user. In other words, where are we going to set them before they do the request, right? So this function is going to register before the view function, no matter what URL is passed. If it's a logged in user coming in, we're going to double check that their session is valid, double check the user on the database, and we can pass it back. So this allows us to work with that user and make sure that they have a session ID and that it's valid. Does anybody know what that typically is trying to prevent there? You guys may not have studied that yet.
Session hijacking.
Yep, session hijacking. So this is trying to help prevent session hijacking as well as cross-site forgery type stuff where you can generate the cookie on the hacking side and log in as a user and never have their username and password, right? Yes, come take my master's degree. No. We very well could go over and show how you could prevent that. That's one of my goals in this class is obviously with the cybersecurity backend is making sure you're generating secure web apps as we're going through there. Okay, we obviously need a function for people to log out, right? And we want to clear that session, obviously, so that we're not leaving that stale out there, so that we're not open to session hijacking. So we'll go ahead and create another function down here that is going to just be the logout, and that'll clear our session and redirect them back to our index. All right, we have yet another view we're going to add. This view is the ability for them to get into the function wrap there. So we have this login required. And what this is going to do is make sure that if they're trying to access something like a blog post, that they are actually authenticated. So this decorator that we're creating here is going to make sure that they are actually authenticated before they can get to that. All right, anybody have any other questions? Yeah. Uh-huh. Yes.
After I log in, that's the way the login back to the login, like index page, not the blog post.
By default, at this point, yes, it does not chase you back. In other words, it's not passing something to say, eventually take me back here. We would have to build that functionality. Yep, but you're exactly right. So right here, if that user is not established, we're going to redirect them back to the auth.login page. Now, we are taking in the view that they're coming in with this quargs. I would suspect that this quargs, if we actually look at this view dictionary, that it's setting up specifically what you just said, which would allow them to chase back to the right post. We'll find out for sure, but generally that's what that's used for and what I've seen. Okay. Other endpoints in this last little bit that it's talking about, you can use this URL for, again, this is so that we don't have to generate that. We basically go and look that up off the function, and therefore we don't have to create this specific app route. This will send us to that particular section. Anybody have any questions on routing and setting up views? So think of views as essentially pages, right? You have a page, in this case, the login page or whatever's associated with it. You will have functionality inside of that view for a get and functionality for a post if you have a form on that page. If it's just a flat page, it's probably just a get. That's all you have to set up. All right, let's move on to templates. So this will be the chunk that we really need to understand. All right, so as it's saying, if we actually tried to run all of this and then go to one of those URLs, we're going to get templates not found, right? That's because we are trying to call a render template, but we haven't written any templates yet. Templates themselves are going to go in here. These are going to be basically HTML templates. They contain static data as well as placeholders for us to inject dynamic data that comes out of the database. Right? Flask uses Jenga to render those templates. We also will use that in Django. So it's good for you to become familiar with these type of templates. Let's see, is any of this important here? We'll talk about that stuff once we get into the template. So inside this Flask R app, they want us to build the templates folder inside of that because we are loading it up as a module as a whole. So if we go to new and directory and we call it templates, we use this outer templates inside, or as inner templates, I should say. And then we're going to create a base HTML file. So new HTML file, we're going to call it base. We're going to add this to our Git. And then we're going to go ahead and copy this entire code in. And if we look at this type of code, you'll notice when you build a flat HTML page, you typically have a title page, right? Or a title up at the top. Here, this is going to allow us to pass in a variable of title into this template, and then it's going to be something -flaskr as it goes through there. So the beauty of that is when we pass in a title, this could be the same template for our login page, could be the same template for our base of everything. This is just our generic base boilerplate. If you deal with like Bootstrap, I was talking about, etc., they're going to talk about boilerplates, which is just the basics of your HTML stuff. All right. When we set up style sheets, we can again reference over to our own style sheet. And so we have this URL for. Notice that when we do like this block title, you're going to have a curly bracket percentage. They have a keyword, a block, and then you're passing in the variable called title. Once you do any kind of blocks like this, you have to set up an end block. And that's usually what screws most people up. Is you have to do an end block, you have to do an end for loop, you have to do that kind of stuff aside. So if we look in here, for example, we check to see if we have if G user. In other words, when they log in here, if there is a session established, then we're going to go ahead and put their username at the top, and we're going to head and have a logout link up there at the top. If they are not logged in, we're going to send them over to the links for register and the page to log in. Notice that we have to end our if statement. So we have an if, we have an else, but we have to have an end if. Outside of that, we create another section for content, and this is where we're actually going to dump in our code. You'll see that we set up a block called header. Then we have 4 messages in our flash message. This is set up if there's any errors, we can actually pop it up in our web application. We end that for loop and go ahead and have our block called content. And this will become more relevant here in a little bit. End our section, that's the end of the code there. All right. Anybody have any questions over this particular template? Yes. Yes. Yep. So these are basically placeholders. All this is doing is basically building the header across the top of our screen where it has our username and a logout at the top. If we're not logged in, then it's just going to display a register page and a login page. That's all we're going to see. And of course, that's at the top of every single page of our application. So that's why we're using this base HTML. When we build out specific ones for register, like next, we are injecting whatever we're putting there into this content block. So for example, we're now going to create the register template.
I'm sorry, back at the base.
Yeah.
At the base template. In the second line, the word Flasker at the end, I'm running this and it shows up on the top. Now I wanted to change it, so I put some other text there, but it's always Flasker, no matter what you put there. So I'm not sure.
As long as you change your base template, it should adjust this here. And you want to make sure you do it inside this title block here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if we put something like INF601, we should see that when we go to register here in a little bit.
Okay.
we'll give it a shot, but it should. That's the whole basics of using this templating system. And so if we look at register, the first thing we put at the top, and you have to put this at the very top, is that we're going to extend the base HTML file. So this means import the base HTML file. From there, we're going to go ahead and set up our blocks. So notice here, we're setting up our block header, which is going to allow us to inject that code right up in here to the block header. Right? When we look down here at the block for content, this is where we're setting up our simple form. So this code for this form is going to get injected in this section here when we use our template system. Does anybody have any questions over how that works? It takes a little bit to get familiar with how the whole template system works, but once you figure it out, it's really slick because it saves you writing the same HTML code over and over and over. And then if you want to make a change in the header, you go fix that little chunk of code. You don't have to fix every single HTML code after that. Having recently built a website based on this, it saves you so much time. So for example, I'm just going to kind of bring this up here. This was actually a Django app that I built, but it's the same concept in Flask, where I have this header going across the top here. Instead of me having to put this in every single page, I have a base HTML that sets up this URL, this main header, and this footer down here at the bottom. Everything inside of that is all injected different templates. So if I go to the events page, you'll notice all of this stayed the same. This stayed the same, but the content in the middle is what got changed. Now, in this case, I have a second series of navigation up here at the top. If you stay on any one of these pages, it always sticks there. If you go back to one of the original ones, that goes away. That's two different templates that are being rendered inside of there. So we're going to be building the same concept in the one we're doing now. All right. So we have our base HTML, we have our register page where we're going to inject that code in there. And now we're going to build out our login code. So we have our login.html. And if you look at this one, it's very similar. We're going to extend our base HTML code. We're going to put a new header title in here that's called login. Notice how we're injecting login page. And then in the content, we have yet another form for us to fill out in order to log in. All right. So if we save our content and we go ahead and start our Flask tutorial, go, and we launch our current website, you'll notice that we just have hello world come up, right? So if you remember, the reason that is if we have our hello.py, that is actually the only app route that we currently have set up. So we would want to go to our /app, and we don't have a URL. If we go over here to our init, we should have, trying to remember what we set up as the default one. I think there's some stuff I didn't clear out of there. Yeah, just auth, right? So we have our auth blueprint. So I need to go to auth. And then inside of here, we'll go to the register page. Is that not pulling up? Let's look down here. Get auth register 404. Should have pulled up. I think this is a routing issue from the original program I had here. So in other words, where I left off the other day, I didn't keep everything I was supposed to. All right, let me pause this real quick. Okay, so the reason it wasn't working was I tried to hit play up here at the top. That's specifically calling the hello package that I had before. So when we want to deal with this inner app, which is just called Flaskar, we actually need to run that command to start that down in our terminal. We can't just use the play up here. If you wanted to use this, you would have to set up that particular execution to run as the Flask tutorial as a whole, or over to this init.py to get it started. The command to get it started is just Flask space --app space Flaskar, which is the name of this folder, this module that we created, and then --debug space run, and that's going to turn on debug. And that is right here in the tutorial. If you actually follow directions, it's right here. So I just missed it. That's my fault. I was assuming that if we hit play, it would have started me from inside the app. It does not. So just be aware of that. You can. Yep, that's what I mean. Is you can come up here, edit configuration, and instead of targeting this file, we would actually target the Flaskar init file that's inside of there. Yep. Matter of fact, you'll target this module name is what you'll end up targeting. So, okay. That will get that up and running. Let me get back to where we were in here just after templates. Okay. And so now if we run this specifically, you can also double check this. When you run this code, of course, I've got some broken stuff here. You'll notice it says serving Flask app Flaskar. We need it to say Flaskar and not hello. If it says hello, then you've got the wrong thing set up. All right. So we're here, we're started, and we should be able to go to auth register. And you're going to see that we do not have a register.html. Is that because I can't spell?
If you expand templates in the project folder, register, they have it under an Auth folder. So they have a folder under templates called Auth and another folder called blog.
That's
and
where I messed
login. Yeah, login and register need to go under Auth.
Yep. And the reason for that is when you set up these templates, our overall application is called Flaskar. We need to specifically state the ones for the blueprint that we're wanting to use. So I just missed a directory here. We need auth. And we would move our login under there, refactor, and our register under there. I bet that base should be under there too. Nope, it's under the whole thing. So we're good there. So just register and login should be underneath of there. Okay, once that's up and running, you'll notice down below here, you can cancel this and then restart it if you want to. There we go. Start serving Flask, Flask app Flaskar. And then up here, if we click on this URL, we don't have an index page yet. So if we go to /auth/register, we got our little register page pop up here. Okay. And if we look at this, it's rendering this basic HTML, which if you notice up here, it's going to be kind of hard unless I full screen this. Up at the top, the title is up here, register, and then we have -INF601. So if we'd have left the original, that should say Flaskar up here. Yeah. Auth, yes, because that's the name of our blueprint. Yep. So under auth, we should have login and register inside of there. And again, if I'd have followed directions, which is always good, you would see that it's there. I just completely overlooked it. So yes, I make mistakes too. But you're going to run into this kind of stuff and being able to troubleshoot it out. So great job, Sam, for catching that one.
I just
All
had the advantage of doing it before.
Okay. So we see this, we get our template here. If we actually type something in and hit register, you'll see down here, we're going to get this page coming up and nothing actually happens. Now we get, actually something did happen. Does anybody see what happened? It's kind of hard because we don't have a super advanced template here. but you'll notice we got redirected to Auth login at the top. We now have 2 pages for register and login, but under this login section, we now have a login button here as opposed to a register button. So if I log in, now we're going to get a URL error because we don't have an index page yet, right? And we knew that. Okay, so we now have the authentication portion of our template all set up. Let's go out to our static files. So static files, this is where we're going to be able to set up our CSS. This is where we're going to be able to style our pages. Obviously, what we were dealing with here looks extremely basic and bland, right? This is stuff that you would have done in INF601 before you applied cool style sheets to it. So we need to create style sheets and we need to set up that kind of stuff. If you notice back in our template, we are going for this style.css. So inside our Flask R, we need to actually create a static directory. And inside that static directory, that's where we're going to load up our style sheet. Now, this is the style sheet they created for their project here. So if we go to new, we come down to style sheet, and we're going to call this one style. And then we can go ahead and paste this code in. So does anybody know what I've done here and I should have done before I started this? Before I started the static stuff? What should I have done? No, we should be good there. We're on a project, and I just went to the next section of the project. Commit, right? So I made a mistake here because we need to make sure that we commit after every little chunk inside our project. If we don't, and we get to working on this, I can't revert back, right? We just saw how easy it was to blow stuff up. Always do a commit and push on side of it. So real quick, I'm going to do a commit. We already set up the back end. Now we set up our blueprint and our views. We also set up our authentication. Then templates. And views. Okay. Commit and push. Now, the reason I went back and stressed that is in your final project, I want to see these level of commits. So in your final project for the semester where you have like 5 weeks to work on it, I want to see that you guys are doing little pieces and then doing a commit. Little pieces, doing a commit. If you turn in the whole project and there's 2 commits, that's a problem. And that's actually outlined in the rubric that you have to have your commits and all that kind of stuff. Trust me, it's to your advantage to do it that way. Okay. I'm not going to spend time on explaining what CSS is in the code. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with at least CSS at this point at its most basic level, right? This is where you could use advanced style sheets, something like Bootstrap or whatever else. We're going to cover that in the Django section, not here in Flask. We're just going to set up our own style code here. So now that we have that in, if we go back to our login page, whoops, sorry about that. On the online, I hit the wrong page. Move this back over here. I really messed it all up. Let's go here, here, and our login. And if we refresh our login page, notice that we have a much better looking web application at this point. So if we want to see what our style sheet did here, we'll blur that one out. We can come back and look and see that we did all these different highlightings in gray. If we right click and inspect, we can look at our individual elements. If you guys don't remember this kind of stuff, you do want to be able to do this so you can come in and look. If you look over here on the styles, we can see the styles and what we set up over here on the right-hand side. So when you're doing little web applications, it's handy to have this up and running so that you can edit these little sections and see what you need to. So specifically for this H1, I can see that I have navigation of a flex. And on a color, I have this little light blue here for the text on side of it. And if we come down here and I actually look at the header for the gray, there we go. This is inherited from that. I could go ahead and actually change that to something else if I wanted to, like red. And now the back end of the page is red. Okay. Now, obviously, when I refresh the page, it's going to go back, right? That's just live editing of the CSS. You would want to go back and edit that inside your pie charm if you really wanted that color to change. For example, this light gray, we would change to something else. All right. Again, once you change this and refresh, you should immediately be able to pull that CSS file there. You'll notice before, if you're paying attention to the debug, when our page called for that CSS, they're getting a 404 error. That's the reason it wasn't showing up before. We hadn't created it yet. When it's working, they should get a 200, which is what they're getting here. And then a 304 is in order to pull that out. Okay. But you should be seeing 200s on that when it actually pulls it. 200, 404. Does anybody know what a 304 is? Not modified. So why would we get a not modified response code from our web server? All right, we got our initial 200 that came out here. And then from that point on, we're getting 304s for that style sheet. Anybody think of what's going on there? What's that? It's seeing it. And it's saying that it wasn't modified. Nothing's changed on that style sheet. So what's happening?
It's reading it from cache.
Got it. So the web server is caching that document because it's now recognizing there's no changes. It's live sending it over to the user. Nothing's changed in the style sheet. Therefore, it's cached. It's in our browser cache at that point. All right. That's important because if we make a bunch of changes but don't save the file and we can't figure out what's going on, it's because it got cached by the web server. Or if you're not seeing that, you may need to clear your browser cache in order to get that to show up. Does anybody know the quick way of clearing their browser cache and telling it to pull all the files? Hold your shift key and hit the refresh at the top. That will force it to repull everything on that page. All right. Trust me, I don't know how many times I've edited files, done it, and I'm stuck on a stupid browser cache that isn't refreshing that page. So holding shift down and going to that will work. You could also load this up in an incognito window or a private window, depending on what browser you like to use. That will also help that as well. Okay. All right. So now we're going to continue on to the blog section. We've got about, well, we got some time here. We got 25 minutes. So to set up the blog blueprint, I cannot talk. I've talked so many times publicly this week. My voice is shot. So in our initial Flask app, you remember that we have an auth, we have a DB and a schema. We need to create one called blog. So we go to a new Python file, throw in our blog, and add this in. And once again, I should have done a commit. So git commit. Here we're going to see set up our static files, particularly mainly just our style sheet, right? Okay. Commit. Make sure you, again, not only commit, that you go ahead and just push it right away. That way, if something happens to your laptop, it's out on GitHub. Right? And you may think that your laptop's going to live forever, and then one morning you wake up and a Windows update from Tuesday night just took down your machine. That happened to me when I was building out that lovely Hayland Farms that you were seeing there. Ton of code, but it was all committed locally to my machine because I didn't hit the push side of things. And then my entire hard drive got BitLocker encrypted, or it was already BitLocker encrypted, but during the process of its encryption that day, the computer died. And so it corrupted the entire hard drive. Unfortunately, the entire Hayland stuff was on there at that point in time. So That's the reason I stress these commits and these pushes, because in real life, when I built websites with this stuff, I broke it and I screwed up, and learned from my lessons. Don't do it on your own. Your client, if you're doing this for somebody, will be really upset with you if they don't have code. Thankfully, the client in this case was a future father-in-law, and I told him just to relax. It'll be fine. Okay. Blog. We're going to copy this code in here. If you guys remember from the auth, we're basically doing this initial import to set up our render templates, redirects, all the common stuff that we need inside of there. We also have our session cookies up here, and we have our auth that we're bringing in, as well as our database modules that we're going to bring in there. Okay. So we come down here, we need to edit our init, and this is what Sam was showing us earlier. So we need to now put in our section for the blog portion, and we don't want that whole thing. Sorry, we just want this code here. Now, if you take a moment to look at what I'm copying in here, we have from blog and bringing all this in. How does this differ from what Sam sent me here in the chat? Anybody besides Sam tell me how this that I just imported is different? So here's over here what I imported, or what I pasted in. Here's what Sam sent me. What's the difference? Has comments, right? Which one do you think's better? Sam's, right? The reason for that is later on when you're trying to figure out what does that chunk of code do? Well, throw a simple comment in there, right? So remember, and you'll remember this inside your final documentation, one of those sections of the rubric is documentation, and you need to document each one of these chunks of code. So yes, you can follow along with this simple blog, but the more notes you take up here, the better off you are, because later on when you have no clue where to go find that stuff, that's the documentation. The other part of that is if you'll go out here and you'll notice what Sam sent us in the beginning, and sorry, Sam, I'm going to keep using you because you're doing it the right way. He's building out this documentation in his README, right? If you build those other comments the right way in the beginning, later on, if you need to build documentation for your entire application, it can actually pull from those comments to build the actual documentation for you. Therefore, you don't have to go back and hand code it. It will pull from your comments. What's that?
You might want to refresh this page. There's been a few comments.
Oh, okay. Perfect. So there you go. You can see that he modified and updated that in a way that used a much better markdown. Is that what you modified?
Right, and I added the command to run locally.
It's fantastic. So go through here, try to keep this stuff as clean as going through here. Or as, I don't want to say as clean as Sam's, but keep it as clean as Sam's. I'll say that. Because Sam's doing a good job of documentation. Now, I know Sam because Sam does all of his stuff for his Power CLI stuff. He knows how to write documentation. Otherwise, he gets lost. Right, Sam?
Absolutely. Especially when it gets into tens of thousands of lines of code. There's just no way without documentation.
Yep. Okay. We need to create our index file. So if you'll remember our original index, it's going to bring up our whole blog thing. We need to create that. So we run through here on our templates. Actually, it's just our main blog. There we go. Okay. And we need to set up the route for our index. We look at this one. It's nothing special other than notice how we do not have it set up to do a post and a get, right? And the reason is we're just displaying a page with some content on it. So we don't need a post because we don't have any kind of form on this particular page that's coming in there. So if we look up here, we are just setting up our database. We're going to execute a select from our database, specifically pulling the ID, the title, the body, the created ID, the username that posted it. And we're going to do some funky join stuff between two user tables. All right. So we're going to select a bunch of stuff out of this particular information. We're also going to join our post database along with our user database. And we're going to join those on the author ID. You guys go all the way back to our schema. Remember that we set up this foreign key on this post table to map back to our user ID table here. So obviously you have to know a little bit of SQL in order to organize this, but we can certainly do that. We have an extended string here that's saying we're going to make sure that we ordered this by the created. At the end of the day, what this is doing is fetching out of the database every single post that we've ever done. We're going to order it by our author ID, and we're going to order it by the date it was created. And we're going to do it in a descending fashion. Real simple SQL command. Then we have to obviously render that information out to the page. So we're going to send that data that we got back from the post, and we're going to send that over to our index.html template. Okay. So now we got to set up that template. So if we go into templates and we need to set up our blog folder. And inside there, we need to create our index file, HTML, index, add, and we'll copy this in. If we look at this block content here, we're just setting up a simple title. We're going to have our header portion that tells you that you have the option to set up a create tag if you're logged in. Notice how we have g.user. G.user signifies that they have to be logged in order to see this stuff. All right. Under the block content, remember, we are pulling from the database a bunch of records, right? That's going to be sent into basically a list. And in that case, we need to do a simple for loop to go through each post that came back from the database. Inside of there, we set up some simple HTML code. So instead of us having to build out this whole table on the screen of every individual block of HTML code, this is the power of Jenga templates, is that we can do a simple for loop and it will automatically generate that all the way down the page. So for every blog that we pull out, we tell it the format we want it to display. It will dynamically generate the HTML code on the fly. We're going to compare that here in just a second. We set this part up. If not loop last, it's going to pull it back around. All right. Loop last is just a special variable within Jenga for loops to make sure that it is the last loop. If we're in the last part of our loop, then you can execute code at the end. In this case, we're putting the HR. Does anybody know what HR means?
It's a line, just a long line across.
Exactly. We're just going to create a new line after each one inside of there. If we get to the last one, we don't need to create that. Very similar to a line break, right? In the same section. Okay. So that's our main template. We also need to set up our create in order to create a blog post. So if we come back to our blog.py, we set up another method over here, or I'm sorry, a function. Notice on this particular function, we have this decorator of @login required. So @login required means we cannot get to the create if we're not logged in. Pretty simple, right? We don't want people to be able to create stuff unless they're logged in. I hit the wrong button there. There we go. Okay. Same way, because this one is going to allow us to post information that we typed in, we always set up the post first. Then if it's not the post, we're going to go ahead and do whatever we want for the get. So when you guys build out your functions, hint, hint, wink, wink, your post information always comes before your get information when you're setting up your function. That may or may not be like a midterm quiz question kind of thing, right? When you're setting up a function, which one comes first, post or get? It's always post. Inside the, you know what I mean? So when you're building out your function, you have to do your post first and then the get. And you're right, because by default, when you go to that decorator, it's a get, therefore it should skip everything and just render. Then the next time we hit submit to go back, we should now be in a post and render that data. I've tried doing it the other way. Things are not happy. So you always do post first, then you do gets. Okay. Let's see here. We also need to create our create template. So we go to blog, new, and HTML. This will be our create. That in here. Post in this. Okay. That one, we're going to simply just extend our base HTML, have a new post, and we have a really basic form that's going to post that in there. All right. Let's go back to our blog. We need one that will specifically pull a given post that we're looking for, and we have to check to make sure that that's in there. So both update and the delete views are going to fetch a post by the ID, aka the users that created those, right? And it's going to check if that author matches the current logged in user. In order to avoid duplicating code, we can write a simple function that will get a post and call it from each individual view. That's where we have this simple abort thing. So if it doesn't have, if it becomes a 404, a 403, anything like that, we're going to abort and send them out to another page. So let's look at this. This is going to allow us to get a specific post. And we're going to try to select that information based on the session cookie that we have there. This post, if it doesn't work, we're going to send an abort 404. That post does not exist. Notice how we are creating our own error message when we use abort. So instead of just blasting 404 on the screen, we are specifically creating an error message that says that post ID does not exist. Now, in our very simple web application, we're generating a flat HTML code that just says that doesn't exist, and we'll try that. In an advanced web application, say, for example, you're using like Bootstrap, you may have one of those really cool sliders that pops down with a red arrow across the screen and says that that ID is not found. So we would rewrite that to do something like a cool little slider in there. All right. We have the abort, we have the check author. Now we need to update the post. So if we're going to edit the post, we're going to create an update function for that. Let's get that pasted in there real quick. Space in there. There we go. And this is basically saying pull the information. If not, we're going to go ahead and update everything, the title, request, all that kind of stuff in there. All right, we need an update template, which is going to allow us to have a different page if we're changing a particular post. Call this update. Go ahead and put this HTML code in. Okay. That particular one has two forms. One is going to be for the update of the ID, and then the other form is specifying the action that we're doing there. So if we're deleting it, or if we are doing something else, the button itself is using a little bit of JavaScript in order to show the confirmation dialog before going through, right? So that means we're probably going to need a little bit of JavaScript here in a minute. Okay. Last but not least, we need a route to set up for the delete side of things. So in our blog.py, we set up a route that goes ahead and allows us to delete that particular post. All right, so let's check and make sure that everything's running right, because we have this running down below here, and every time we make an edit, it goes ahead and restarts the server for us. We could go over to, go away, come on, come on, come on. There we go, login. And if we just go to the main page now, notice how we actually get our index page to pull. So by default, if we go to just our URL, which is just going to be an IP address at this point, we see our Flask R up here. You'll notice if we go full screen, we have post-INF601 because we made that modification. We can either log in or not. At this point, we're not logged in. So we're going to go ahead and log in. And I don't have that correct username. So notice how this popped up with a little blue box. If we wanted to make like a JavaScript alert, we could do that where it would pop up on the middle of the screen with a little JavaScript pop up and say incorrect username. They would have to click OK and then move on. Right? In this case, we're going to go ahead and log in because we do have a user. Might need to recreate it here. There we go. Notice how it doesn't allow us to have two different users inside of there, right? Let's go back to login. Must have changed that password differently. So let's create a new one. Okay, and now we're going to log in with our new user. Okay. Now that I'm in the system, notice how we have this new that popped up here, and we're still using this base template, so everything looks the same. If we right click in here and inspect, and we look at our body, notice in our section, we have our headers here, we have a post, and then everything below that, we have nothing in the body, right? We have this section specifically for content, nothing's getting generated inside. So if we click new, we have this new template that pulls up here. We can say hello world. And in the body of our blog post, we can say this is our first post in INF601. Save it. And notice how we now have this blog post here. If we go back and look at the inspection, and we see this article here, the header, and we have this information that goes inside of it, right? Notice that we have edit here, right? If I log out and I register a new account, and I am now Lori, thanks Lori for being our example, and I register for that account. Now, if I log in, notice that I cannot edit Jason Zeller's Hello World post, right? And we check this, if you remember back in our code, in order for us to edit, or in other words, update, we have to be logged in and it has to match our given title going through there. If it doesn't match our ID, we don't have that permission to do that. Okay. If we click on a new post for this, and our title is all right, so Lori says she rules the world. Notice how we have the edit for her button show up here. All right, we log out, we can see our two blog posts inside of here. Now these have individual IDs, but we never really reference that out to the user. If we go out to our inspection of each one of these, notice how we have two different articles that are showing up. The headers that go in here and pull that out inside of there. Now, we want to figure out what those IDs are. So if we come back out here to our program, and on the right-hand side, if we click on our database, if it's still set up, which it should be from what we showed you on Tuesday, if we come out to the post section and we look at our, where's our post table? There we go, tables, user and post. There we go, keys, columns. This is just show me the data. It's not the actual connection. Refresh the connection here. All right, so if we jump to this query console and we say open default console, this console here would allow us to execute SQL code so we could see what would come back. So if we go back to our project and we look specifically at our, say, blog, right? And if we click on this and go back to, oh, where did that go? Console. We can run a select query like this here, right? Well, this obviously isn't going to pull because we don't know what that PID is at this point. So we want to select all of those, right? So if we select star from user and hit enter, then if we execute this code by hitting this play button, you'll notice down here, should pop up, it pulls out those tables for us. So this is how you can interact with the database to make sure that the data in your database is accurate. And you can do that all within PyCharm. Really simple SQL commands up here to make sure you got it. So here we have three different ones. If you'll notice in that password field, just like what Sam was talking about, by default, they're using SHA-256 and it's being salted on top of that. So those are fairly decent password security inside of there. All right. If we go and do a select all, and that's what the star means, select all from posts. And we, sorry, have to have our semicolon at the end. Actually, it's just post, right? Yep, not post, but post. We hit play, execute, and we can see those two posts come in there. So we have a post ID of 1, 2, and then the author ID is 2 and 3. Because this is doing a foreign key lookup for this one here, we would go back and look at our users. So if we did both of these at the same time, select star from user, and it'll ask which one you want to execute. We're going to do this one. And you'll notice that we have the usernames and passwords come up here because that's the last one it executes. We can join those two tables together on a certain one, which is exactly what our code does on the auth.py right here. So here where we do a select from star where user, where the ID is 1. That's when we look up there and we're specifically looking to make sure that user's logged in. Here, you can run this where username equals question mark. That's where we're taking in the input from the user in the login form, right? So if I take this and I want to see what this looks like, and I go back to my console, I can even type that in here specifically where user equals question mark. Instead of question mark, we would say something like JL Zeller, a semicolon at the end, hit play, and you'll notice that we were able to pull that record back. Does anybody have any questions over how to check the data that's in the database and all that kind of stuff? It's very handy to be able for you to go and look it out. This database section up here is just going to remind you of what your schema is over here. You just need to click on this console and then you can start running queries against your database to pull that information back. There's also some specific, there's a specific application within JetBrains that'll allow you to do a whole lot more database navigation, test queries, that kind of stuff against that as well. But you can use this little portion built in here to test it. All right. So our cute little project is up and running. What we will cover starting next week is I'll come through and show you how to make this installable, how to set it up where people can do it. In this case, we have like essentially all the stuff we would set up in order to push this out to GitHub, right? It's functioning, it's working on your system, but we got to set up all the requirements files. We have to set up everything so that people can grab it from your GitHub file and download it and install everything inside of it. We'll also cover a little bit of test coverage so we can write unit tests into here. We'll cover this on Tuesday. And last but not least, how you can actually push this out to the internet in order to publish this on something. So for now, just make sure you can at least get all the way up to the part where you are going to make the project installable. Anybody got any questions? So again, next week, we're going to go through the process of polishing it, getting it posted up on GitHub. Then we're going to go through and set up unit tests and then make it production ready. And at the end of that, you guys will have a mini project next week, as well as a quiz over this Flask stuff. All right. Anybody online have any questions? Sam, Kush?
Nope. I'm good.
All righty. Stop the share. Stop the recording.